Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the Sleepy Vaughn Manor, where we don't sleep, especially on New Year's Eve when there are a bunch of explosions all night long and gunshots and fireworks and other things to keep you awake, and a nervous little dog, Rhonda, who thinks the world is coming to an end because of all the explosions. So, I didn't sleep last night, and yet here I am at 7:30 in the morning making a video for you. Because it is January 1st, which means it's time to talk about every single book I read last year. Every single book. Let's talk about every single book I read. A little bit about them anyway. I should probably get to page 1. I actually read more books than I thought because when I originally made this list, I forgot to put a book in there. So that was exciting. I read more than I thought. Number 1 was Logan's Run by George Clayton Johnson and William F. Nolan. I enjoyed this book quite a bit. A lot of fun, this science fiction novel. It's not a lot like the movie, or at least it has some pretty significant differences from the film. I really enjoyed the film, but I think the book might actually be better. Really enjoyed it. Number 2 was The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Part 1 of The Lord of the Rings. I never read the rest of The Lord of the Rings this year. I've read these books before, of course, but I intended to read all of The Lord of the Rings this year, and I didn't after this one, even though I really enjoyed reading this. So I'm going to have to get back to that. I'm not sure what happened there. Number 3 was The Savage Tales of Solomon Kane by Robert E. Howard, one of my favorite writers of all time, Robert E. Howard, and I loved this series of stories. The Solomon Kane stories, the avenging Puritan who travels the world to right wrongs. An excellent set of stories from the king of sword and sorcery, Robert E. Howard. Moving on to number 4, Firestarter by Stephen King. This was an okay Stephen King book. There were some good things about it. There were some things about it that weren't so good. It was okay. Number 5, The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This was excellent. This is a ghost story that started off creepy and ended up pretty terrifying by the end. Number 6, The Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov. The first of his robot novels. I intended to read all his robot novels and stories this year, but much like The Lord of the Rings, I read this and then didn't read any more of them, but I'll get to those. I enjoyed Caves of Steel. It's one of my favorite Isaac Asimov novels. I know it's not his best, but I like it an awful lot. Number 7, Jarell of Jory by C.L. Moore. This is an excellent collection of fantasy stories originally published in Weird Tales in the 1930s about a very strong female warrior, actually. And these stories are weird, man, and they're really good. I highly recommend these stories. Number 8, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. Now, this is an excellent book. Some classic stories in here, retold fairy tales, horror stories. It's really good. You should read this book. Number 9, Swords Against Darkness, edited by Andrew J. Offutt. This was the first in a series of paperback anthologies that had heroic fantasy stories, basically sword and sorcery stories, and it was really good. Really good. I kind of wish I had picked up the rest of these anthologies before I went on my 500 book challenge, but what do you do? Let's see, number 10, Midnight Sun, The Complete Stories of Kane by Carl Edward Wagner. This is a collection of all of his Kane stories. The Kane stories, classic, dark fantasy from the 1970s. There were some stories from the 1980s in here, but they weren't as good. But yeah, Carl Edward Wagner, an author that definitely should be read more. He's really good. Number 11, The Third Cry to Legba and Other Invocations by Manly Wade Wellman. Speaking of writers who should be read more often, really cool collection of fantasy stories, horror and fantasy stories with a supernatural investigator, Thunstone. This has the Thunstone stories in them, and it's really good. I really enjoyed this one. This is volume 1 in the selected stories of Manly Wade Wellman. I have them all, so I should read more of them, and I probably will this year. Where are we? We are at number 12, Shogun by James Clavell. Shogun. I mainly remembered this from the television miniseries that I saw as a kid. Finally read the book. It was giant. I kind of wished it was more giant because I really, really enjoyed this book. It's really good. Number 13 was Moon Lake by Joe R. Lansdale. Not one of Joe R. Lansdale's best books. It's just okay, really. Nothing really new that we haven't seen from Joe R. Lansdale before. It's not bad. It's okay. Number 14, Dance Macabre by Stephen King. This is Stephen King's take on the horror genre, at least up until the early 1980s when he wrote this book. It's actually really interesting. It's a really interesting book about horror and his own feelings about horror. So it's well worth a read, especially if you're a horror fan or a Stephen King fan. Number 15 was Cujo by Stephen King, about a terrifying dog. A dog who starts off as a good dog, but then he gets rabies and he becomes an insane monster. I didn't like this so much when I read it the first time when I was a teenager because there was a bunch of stuff about adult relationships in it. But I appreciated it a lot more now. I liked it a lot more the second time I read it. It's pretty good, actually. Number 16, The Good Old Stuff by Gardner Dozois. A collection of classic science fiction adventure stories. This was a ton of fun. Number 17 was I, the Jury by Mickey Spillane, the first Mike Hammer novel. And I meant to read more of these. I have them all. But I didn't read any more of these this year, or last year. So I'm going to have to read more of those. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. Number 18 was Ghost Story by Peter Straub. Ghost Story, which I often see mixed reviews on. Some people hate it. Some people really love it. I really liked it. I thought it was a really good supernatural novel. It was good, I thought. Number 19 was The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Andor. This is a classic werewolf novel. It's not a classic in the same league as, say, Frankenstein or Dracula, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it's a really interesting werewolf novel with a really terrifying werewolf in it. It's an interesting take on the werewolf. Definitely worth reading. If you're a horror fan, it's almost essential. It's almost essential that you dig this one up and read it. Number 20 was The Forsaken Boy by Troy Tradup. Now, this is another werewolf novel, one that I liked better than The Werewolf of Paris. This was excellent. This is an excellent book. I always recommend this book whenever I get a chance because it was just a great creature features novel. And Troy Tradup actually has his own BookTube channel now, and you should watch it because Troy is awesome. Number 21 was Demons by Daylight by Ramsey Campbell. This was an early collection of horror stories from Ramsey Campbell. Really interesting collection of kind of urban horror stories, very weird horror stories. But I was impressed with it enough that I actually went out and bought the first edition from Arkham House of Demons by Daylight. This is back when I was still buying books before the dreaded 500 book challenge. But yeah, I liked it. I like this collection of stories an awful lot. Again, this is one that gets mixed reviews, but I think it's kind of a classic. Okay, number 22, Haunted Castles by Ray Russell, The Complete Gothic Stories. Excellent collection of horror stories from Ray Russell. This is really good. Kind of a dynamite book. You should check that out. Number 23 was The Dracula Tapes by Fred Saberhagen. This is Dracula's side of the story. So it takes the story from Bram Stoker's Dracula and gives you Dracula's side of the story. Now, Dracula is obviously lying throughout the entirety of this book, but that's okay. It was terribly entertaining. Next was number 24, A Lush and Seething Hell by John Horner Jacobs. This was kind of a disappointment. This is two cosmic horror novellas, and it's just not particularly scary or even disturbing. I think it was trying to be, but it just wasn't effective, I don't think. There were some things wrong with this, with these stories. It wasn't terrible. The writing was actually good. He's a good writer. They just didn't work, I don't think. Anyway, that was that. Number 25 was Weird Woods, edited by John Miller. This is about scary trees. Stories about scary woods and scary trees, and it was a good collection. I recommend it. Number 26 was Women in Trouble by R. St. Clair. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. Really interesting collection of horror stories from R. St. Clair. If you've never read this author before, this is a good place to start, I think. This is where I started, and yeah, it was interesting. I liked it. Number 27, The Gunslinger by Stephen King. I like this book a lot. So I'm definitely looking forward to reading the other Dark Tower books. I haven't slept, excuse me. The other books in the Dark Tower series. I really like this one. The Gunslinger, it's a good book. Excellent fantasy novel. Number 28, Shadow on the Trail by Zane Grey. So this is the first book I read for June on the Range. And this is not the best Zane Grey book that I've read, but it was pretty good. It was a pretty good book if you can get past the absurd period racism that was completely unnecessary. But other than that, excellent Western novel. Then Crossfire Trail by Louis L'Amour. You have to read Louis L'Amour in June on the Range probably, just because he was at one time the most popular writer in America, if not the world. And he wrote a ton of Westerns, just a ton of them. And so even though I've read a bunch of Louis L'Amour, I've never read this one, and I really enjoyed it. It was awful good. Followed by number 30, Fallon, another Louis L'Amour book, one that I liked even more. This was one of my favorite books of the year, actually. Followed by number 31, Buckskin Man by Wayne D. Overholser. Overholser wrote so many Westerns, and this was a good one. This was a good Western. Number 32, Born to Trouble by Nelson Nye. I always enjoy Nelson Nye. Steve Donahue's favorite Western writer, actually, Nelson Nye. And this book was fun. It was kind of a mystery detective Western novel written in Nelson Nye's own particular pulpy style. Next was number 33, Shadow on the Sun by Richard Matheson. This is the only Richard Matheson book I've read this year. I thought it was just going to be a Western by Richard Matheson because he wrote Westerns. But it was actually a horror novel that took place in the Old West. And it was a good horror novel. Not his best, but really good and well worth reading. So a short, quick little horror novel that takes place in the Old West. It was good. So where are we? We are at number 34, Payback at Morning Peak by Gene Hackman. The actor Gene Hackman wrote this book. And it is not bad. It's not bad. It's okay. It's too long for what it is, I think. But not bad. Not bad. That was followed up with number 35, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, which is the best book that I read this year. This book is excellent. It's just as good as everyone says it is. So there's that. Then there's number 36, Christine by Stephen King, about the killer car. I really enjoyed this one a lot. Really enjoyed this novel. Probably not one of Stephen King's best books, but, you know, it's a killer car, and I liked it a lot, actually. Number 37 was The Light at the End by John Skipp and Craig Spector. This is a vampire novel that was written in the 80s, the mid-80s. So it was a paperback from hell, and I really enjoyed it. I liked it the first time I read it, which was probably in the early 90s when I read it for the first time. And I liked it just as much now. It really captures that time, that mid-1980s time. It's a good one. If you ever see it lying around, pick it up. It's excellent. So we are at number 38, The Cry of the Cat by R.L. Stine. The only Goosebumps book I've ever read, and And I read it because it was sent to me by Juan at Plagued by Visions. He kindly sent to me a bunch of books, and this was one of them. So I thought, I ought to read one of these Goosebumps books. I should read at least one. And this one was fun. It was fun. It tried to make a cat scary, and you can't really do that, but it was fun. Next was number 39, Blade, number 1, First Strike by David Robbins. It was not yet Garbogust when I read this, but I was so anxious to start reading trashy books that I read this, and it was just as fun as it looks from the cover. Then Garbogust officially happened, and I read book number 40, The Survivalist number 1, Total War by Jerry Ahern. The survivalist who survives a nuclear catastrophe. This is like one of those 1980s over-the-top action movies. This is kind of like that. Really well written, though. Surprisingly good, actually. And I have a bunch of other survivalist novels, so this Garbogust, I will be reading more from Jerry Ahern. Then we have number 41, Bio of a Space Tyrant, Refugee by Piers Anthony, the first in the Bio of a Space Tyrant novels. This one had its issues. It wasn't great, but you know what? It wasn't terrible either. It was flawed, but it's interesting enough that I have the second one. I'll probably read the second one. Probably will. Number 42 was Solomon Kane, the movie novelization by the horror novelist Ramsey Campbell. So Ramsey Campbell, famous horror writer Ramsey Campbell, wrote the movie novelization of Solomon Kane. The movie, Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane, who I spoke about earlier in this video. So the movie was pretty good. The book was really good. It was a really good book. Sometimes novelizations are good, and this was one of those times. Then I followed that up with number 43, Traitor's Legion by John Jakes. This was an early John Jakes book. John Jakes later became famous for his Kent Family Chronicles series of books and the North and South trilogy. This was a novel of ancient Rome, a really kind of short sword and sandals kind of historical pulpy novel. It was cool. I enjoyed this one. Number 44, Nightwing by Martin Cruz Smith. This could be the greatest animal attacks book I've ever read. I like this one an awful lot. It's good. You should read this if you like horror and animal attacks book. But that was followed up by a terrible book. That was followed up by Vulcan by Kathleen Skye. Wow, this book was bad. This is a Star Trek novel in which none of the characters act like they do on the television show. This book kind of sucked. So that was Vulcan. That was followed up by Doc Savage, The Thousand-Headed Man by Lester Dent. A Doc Savage adventure. So one of the Doc Savage pulp stories. It has some unfortunate period racism in it. But other than that, it's a pretty good Doc Savage adventure. I liked it. It's actually the only Doc Savage book I read this year. I gotta read more of those. Number 47, The Valley of the Flame by Henry Kuttner. Sometimes Henry Kuttner is really good, and this was a fun kind of science fiction lost world novel. This was the first novel I read, the first book I read for my vintage science fiction project, the project where I'm attempting to read every vintage science fiction book that I own before I die. We'll see. We'll see if I can manage it. Number 48 was The Big Book of the Continental Op by Dashiell Hammett. This has every single Continental Op story that Dashiell Hammett wrote, including the two novels, The Dane Curse and Red Harvest, the original magazine versions of those novels. So it's actually more than one book, but it's the big book, so I count it as one. Number 49 was Across the Wire by Stella Telleria, a science fiction novel by Stella Telleria, which was excellent. Stella Telleria has her own BookTube channel. It's too late to apologize. You should check it out. This was a really good book. She's writing a sequel to it, and I don't know if it's coming out this year or not, but yeah, I look forward to it. I can buy books if they're written by my friends. That's the exception to the 500 book challenge. So yeah, I'm definitely going to read the sequel to this one if I get the chance. this year. Like I said, I don't know if it's coming out this year. Number 50 was The Long Winter, also known as The World in Winter by John Christopher. John Christopher destroyed the world once again with an ice age. He likes to destroy the world, John Christopher. That was followed up by number 51, A Wrinkle in the Skin, where John Christopher again destroys the world, this time with terrible earthquakes that happen all over the globe. This one was really good. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. I enjoy it when John Christopher destroys the world. Number 52, Out Among the Ice Beacons by Gareth Howells. This was a really excellent book by Gareth Howells. Gareth, who has the BookTube channel, Books, Songs, and Other Magic. This was his first novel. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Did a review of it on my channel. You should check it out. Number 53, Fantastic Adventures, September 1950. So this was a pulp magazine, which I'm counting as a book because it has so much in it. And my good friend Justin bought this for me a while back, and I finally read it and enjoyed it quite a bit. So yeah, there was that. Then, number 54, The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. Classic science fiction novel by Alfred Bester. It's excellent. You should read it. Number 55, Science Fiction Thinking Machines. This is an anthology by Groff Conklin about computers and robots, but how they were envisaged. I can't speak. I didn't sleep. How people thought they would be back in the 1950s when, computers, took up a whole room. So yeah, science fiction thinking machines. Next, I followed that up with an ace double, The Search for Zai and The Hand of Zai by L. Sprague de Camp. This is actually one novel, but they put it into an ace double. And it was fun. It was a fun kind of Edgar Rice Burroughs kind of story with a lot of humor. Next was Edgar Rice Burroughs' Master of Adventure by Richard A. Lupoff. I read this because I was moving in at this time to the Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive. And this is a book about Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. And it's really, really good. Really good book about Edgar Rice Burroughs novels. So yeah, there was that. Then we moved into the Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive with number 58, A Princess of Mars, Edgar Rice Burroughs' first book. It's great. Then number 59, The Outlaw of Torn by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Not quite as good as Princess of Mars. It's okay. It's an okay historical novel. But then number 60, Tarzan of the Apes. Well, this is what made Burroughs huge, of course. Tarzan of the Apes. And it's a great book. Great classic adventure story. Then number 61 was The Gods of Mars, the sequel to A Princess of Mars, which is, out of all of the Barsoom, aka Mars stories, I think this was the best one. Really enjoyed it. Number 62, The Return of Tarzan, the second Tarzan novel. Could be my favorite Tarzan novel. Number 63 was Why Not You and I by Carl Edward Wagner. A collection of horror stories by Carl Edward Wagner. Really, really good collection. Unfortunately, it's kind of impossible to find now, sadly. Number 64, At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. One of Edgar Rice Burroughs' greatest stories, which takes place in the center of the earth, where there are dinosaurs and cavemen and the sort of dangers, which you would expect for the center of the earth. Next was number 65, Poking Holes by Juan Valencia of Plagued by Visions, the great channel Plagued by Visions. And this is a magnificent and extreme collection of stories. So, horror stories, really good ones. Not for everybody, because, yeah, it's extreme horror, I would say. There's some stuff in here that's like, oh, man. But, man, Juan can write. This guy could write. He's a really good writer. I really look forward to what comes in the future from Juan Valencia, because he's excellent. Number 66 was The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. That was okay. Number 67, Death World by Harry Harrison, which I liked quite a bit. That was an excellent science fiction novel about a guy on a planet where every form of life wants to kill people, the people that are on this planet. Death World. It lives up to its name, and it's a lot of fun. Number 68, man, the sun's coming out. Number 68 was The Monster Men by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the closest Burroughs ever got to a horror novel. And it's interesting, not Burroughs' best work, but really good pulp action horror fun. It's like, you know, it's like a B movie. It's cool. You should check it out if you ever get the chance. Number 69 was another ace double, Planetary Agent X by Mac Reynolds, and Behold the Stars by Kenneth Bulmer. So this was a lot of fun. Science fiction from the 60s. I liked Behold the Stars more than Planetary Agent X, but you know, these ace doubles are almost always worth reading. Good stuff. So that was 69. That was the 69th book I read. But I actually read 69 and a half because I read the first volume of Varney the Vampire. But since it's only half of Varney, I'm only counting it as a half. So I read 69 and a half books. And that was all of them. I'm hoping to do better in 23. I'm hoping to at least get 100 in because I am on the 500 book challenge. It would be nice to finish that, you know, before I'm 60. We'll see if I manage. So yeah, that was everything. I'm gonna shut up now because I've been talking for a long time and I'm really sleepy and I have to put little pictures into this video. Okay guys, I will catch you next time.